a lot of talk of grit and resilience in the world of startups in the Bay or in the United States is often, when your seed funding is almost running out or your VC dollars, in the case of, it could not be more different in the case of many immigrants and refugees.
When you think of an entrepreneur, who comes to mind? A refugee may not be the first person you'd think of, but refugees are in fact 2 to 3 times more likely to be entrepreneurs than the population at large. In the US, for example, 13% of refugees become entrepreneurs compared to 9% of Americans born in the US. Welcome to the Chicago Booth Review podcast, where we bring you insights from some of the world's top policy minds. I'm Hal Weitzman, and today I'm talking with Andrew Leon Hanna, a social entrepreneur, lawyer, and Chicago Booth Adjunct Assistant Professor, whose book, 25 Million Sparks, The Untold Story of Refugee Entrepreneurs, tells the stories of a handful of individual refugees who started their own ventures. In the first of 2 podcasts about the book, we discussed why he thinks refugees are so much more likely to become entrepreneurs. Okay, Andrew Leon Hanna, welcome to the Chicago Booth Review podcast.
Thanks so much, Al. Appreciate it.
It's great to have you here, and you've written this wonderful book, 25 Million Sparks. This is not a traditional business book, right? It's really well written, very captivating, but it's primarily a real human narrative that has business lessons rather than the other way. Typically, what you see is the other way around, right? The business lessons, and then people try and find stories that fit that. You've done the other way around. So you take the journey of these 3 Syrian women refugees, each of whom becomes an entrepreneur in a different area. Yasmina, who makes these wedding dresses and experiences, I guess. Melek, an artist, and Asma, a children's storyteller. Just briefly, please, just tell us something about them.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much. So as you said, the book features 3 Syrian entrepreneurs who fled during the war to the Zetri camp in Jordan, and then kind of zooms out to 20 camps or cities around the world and talks about entrepreneurs who fled their home countries all around the world. But Asma, Melek, and Yasmina. Asma, as you mentioned, is a storyteller, social entrepreneur. She had the situation where her house was burned down in Syria. She had to flee with a very young child. And eventually, when she got to the camp, she suffered a lot of different kind of challenges and difficulties, and she wanted to provide some kind of support for her kids. So she had 2 daughters at the time, Tamara and Maya, and she, had seen that, this was before kind of education infrastructure was built in the camp. It was mostly just tents. And you had a lot of kids kind of going around helping their parents find any kind of means to create income and survive. And Esma said, well, I have always had this passion for education, and I want to uplift these children by bringing a storytelling initiative that will bring them to the trailer and have this kind of magical experience where they can escape in these stories. Number 1, see themselves in the stories and find kind of new ambitions for their lives. I mean, these are children who their whole lives, to date, or much of their lives have been spent with, words like war, bombings, shellings. So bringing these stories that are more about Syrian protagonists who are creating peace or becoming professionals and doing amazing things in the world. And so she would bring them to the trailer to have these readings. And then there was also this education component where there would be activities. They would kind of get better with their skills in reading and literacy. And so there's kind of this dual component, which was almost like a escape and a way to encourage students and youth to see themselves bigger than their problem. And then there's also kind of education skills and kind of continuing their education during this gap. And she actually spoke virtually in our class at Booth just last week, which was very inspiring for the students. Melek is another person I'm still close with. We have been chatting. She's in the camp still. Esma actually relocated to France since. But Melek is an artist, so she was quite young, younger than Esma when she fled from Zetri. And she talks about bringing her crayons and her notebook because art was kind of her outlet for all of her emotions. And she's probably, I think if everything were equal, if there was equal opportunity in the world, she would be the most famous artist in the world. I think her work is really brilliant and amazing across many mediums, from charcoal to watercolor. She does kind of everything. And she became an artist. She started winning some awards. And most importantly to her, she was able to win a scholarship to go to college and expand her work further in Jordan, and actually won some different international awards. But most importantly, she has used her art to help encourage girls in the camp. And so a lot of the work she's done has been on human rights, on girls' rights, and her kind of view is that art can change people's minds more than maybe telling people or telling them what they should do. And she's seen that happen in topics of child marriage and other things. And then Yasmina, as you mentioned, started a wedding shop and salon. She actually was the one who was an entrepreneur before. She was already had her store in Daraa, Syria, but at some point realized I need to kind of go all in on this in the camp. It's going to be a long time here. The war's not getting better, and so she sold all her wedding jewelry, everything really of economic value and personal value that she had, and started her salon business and wedding shop business. And she helps people celebrate even in the midst of a difficult time, and also just a beautiful trailer where she has her store, just colorful.
Yeah, and you describe how lively it is, and you talk about these three people, and as you say, lots of other refugees as well. And where you kind of get to with this is that these are examples of refugees who are successful at being entrepreneurs, and as it turns out, refugees are much more likely to become entrepreneurs and to be successful than those of us who are not refugees. Now, I'm interested in why you think that is, and we're going to get to sort of in the second half of the show. We're going to get to some of the reasons, kind of, that you think that refugees are more likely to become entrepreneurs. But at a psychological level, is it the experience of having become a refugee and what you went through that makes you more likely to be an entrepreneur, or is it that the kind of people who make it through and are able to survive these awful migrations? And the kind of people who are able to make it through and to get to these refugee camps have the kind of skills that will enable them to succeed. What do you think?
Yeah, it's a great question. It bumps up against kind of different types of migrants. So you have immigrants who are folks who choose to leave their home country and go somewhere new. And then refugees and asylum seekers and internally displaced people are kind of forced to leave their homes, internally displaced within their country as refugees and asylum seekers outside of their country. And the actually, immigrants and refugees / asylum seekers, both, displaced people forcibly and people who chose, both have very, very high rates of entrepreneurship. In fact, refugees in the U.S. tend to have a higher rate, even refugees broadly tend to have a higher rate even than immigrants. So what that kind of tells me is it's less about, the people who are really entrepreneurial go out and, they're able to make it, and more so the experience of being forcibly displaced creates a kind of extreme level of entrepreneurship. We'll talk about the kind of several factors, but, it creates in you a level of resilience. It creates in you this commitment where you don't have any other real opportunities and you have to go all in. Whereas, I'm as an entrepreneur myself, like I know I have backup options, and that can be not a great thing actually in terms of level of commitment and going all in, kind of level of engagement and need to make it succeed. And so, I think it's a lot of it is the experience of having to rebuild your life all over again, having to be resourceful, having to get that urgent kind of calling of I need to support my family no matter what, and I don't have a backup option. It builds in people, including my parents, they're immigrants from Egypt, coming to England without any money in their pockets and then come to the U.S. with very little. It creates in you a kind of grit and resourcefulness that I think other people don't necessarily get, or they can get, but not in that way.
You talk about that backup option, and one of the parts that I thought was most interesting about your book was when you dispel some of the myths about entrepreneurship that we so commonly hear in the US. It's about having a can-do mindset, or it's about perseverance, or it's about risk-taking. And you point out very, very well that the risks that the entrepreneurs take in the US pale next to the risks that all refugees take just to survive, let alone to become entrepreneurs. And, in developed countries, startups have all this financial and legal and educational and social infrastructure that refugees just don't have. So talk about that dichotomy, what it taught you about kind of some of the homespun wisdom that we hear about what it takes to be an entrepreneur in the US.
Yeah, I think it's funny. When I was in business school, there was a joke that a lot of the cases were about folks who, made it on their own. They kind of pulled themselves up by their bootstraps and $1 million of their parents' money, and that's obviously not the case.
Like the old joke about
still.
how do you make $1 million? You start with $10 million, right?
Right, exactly. And I think there's still a lot to admire for people who started with stuff and then made it bigger, or started in a economic environment that was more stable. But really, I think we can learn a lot. Folks at all of these schools, entrepreneurs. I think. People who read Forbes, I think the cover should be ESMA, not some of these kind of 30 under 30 folks or whoever it may be. But the reason is because I think you can learn a ton. And I also think their model of entrepreneurship is often more inspiring and more generous and more selfless. But yes, I think a lot of talk of grit and resilience is about, in the world of startups in the Bay or in the United States, is often, when you're seed funding is almost running out, or your VC dollars. It could not be more different in the case of many immigrants and refugees, where it's, there's an example in the book of someone who came to the camp early on and was starting a cell phone repair shop and was basically running back and forth to the hospital to care for his kid. And in that case, it's somebody who has no backup plan, no money really saved up, has no idea how long he's going to be living in this camp, probably has seen or heard of family members dying during the war, all kinds of trauma, all kinds of difficulties, and yet is having to kind of come up with something with no access to capital and no other kind of groundwork laid, just sort of skills or resourcefulness to figure it out. The same with ESMA, the same with Melik, the same with Yasmina. So many times too, it's very little money that is involved. So a lot of the entrepreneurs celebrated here again start with a big loan or a big investment. We talked about Razan in the book, who is in Yorkshire, in England, and she started a company called Yorkshire Dama Cheese, and she kind of combined the resources in Britain, like the milk that she felt was perfect for making this kind of halloumi, squeaky cheese that she knew from Syria, and so that kind of turned into an award-winning business, over £100,000 in revenue. And it started with just a £2,500 loan from the government. And so we're talking about taking almost nothing and starting something huge. And even the folks I work with through my venture, Mona, it's just a loan of $5,000-$6,000 that can turn someone into an entrepreneur that changes the course of their family and their communities. And you don't even have to look further than my own, my father, who again came to the U.S. with very little. My parents did, and started a primary care practice that changed the lives of thousands of people in my hometown. And again, didn't have any startup capital, didn't know anyone, didn't know any lawyers, and had to figure out how to start a medical practice. So I think that's where you can learn, at least be inspired by a level of resourcefulness, a level of resilience, a level of commitment, and recognize that, okay, if they did this with that little, I should believe in myself that if I can push harder and kind of take this example, perhaps I can do something without all of the conventional kind of cushions that we have, often available to us.
Carry the Two is the show that pulls back the curtain to reveal the mathematical and statistical gears that turn the world. Co-hosts Katie Woodkowski and Ian Martin bring unique perspectives from the fields of mathematics and statistics to convey how mathematical research drives the world around us. With each episode tackling a different topic, subscribe to Carry the Two, part of the award-winning University of Chicago podcast network. Okay, Andrew, in your book, you outlined 5 reasons that you think refugees are more likely to become entrepreneurs based on your observations and interacting with a lot of refugee entrepreneurs. And the first one is that innovation is just a way to survive in a refugee environment. And there's a parallel there, isn't there, with people saying, for example, in the US, that if you lose your job, you're much more likely to start a company than if you don't. But this is a more extreme version of it. So tell us about that.
Yeah, I mean, so many of the examples in the book are people who, Yasmina, in Yasmina's case, threw a bunch of kind of trash bags of her belongings into a truck. Actually, she was pregnant at the time of having to leave, which made it even more difficult. and had to come across the border and somehow find a way with her husband to provide for her family. And, as I mentioned, sold her wedding jewelry, sold everything that kind of was significant to her, and said, I'm going all in. And so there's a level of commitment and risk-taking that's involved in this kind of idea of back against the wall, I have to survive, because, again, there's no backup option. And so you have a lot of people who come to new countries. We talk in the book about Utica, New York, which is a quarter refugee, and helped revitalize that city. You have so many stories of people in the book and throughout the world that come to a place and have no other option but to innovate. And the parallel to what you mentioned about people losing their jobs is similar as well. And we'll talk about discrimination, but part of it is if they're not finding ways to get jobs in the kind of normal employment pool, then really it is the only option. And you're facing the reality of my kids not having food to eat or not having any opportunity. And particularly as migrants, in different kind of legal definitions, a lot of times asylum seekers and refugees don't have full access to resources of the government or social safety nets. And so it becomes really like, I either make this salon and wedding shop work, or I'm relying on, in the camp, I'm relying on just some rations of bread every day. Or if you're in a city that doesn't even have that, you're in a host city, or you went to Utica, New York, or Jacksonville, Florida, wherever it is, then you're relying on some government funding or support if there is. But after that, 90-day period or whatever it is, I have to start this business and it has to succeed.
Right. So so that's the first one, is that just to survive, you have to be innovative. The second one that you identify is that they have been exposed to different cultures. And you talked about the Syrian woman who started the English halloumi cheese business, which has become very successful. So tell us about that, about how bringing one culture to another, or finding something different, looking at an environment in a different way with fresh eyes, can bring opportunity.
Yeah, there have been a few studies that showed that students, even who study abroad and come back, end up having better or more kind of promising business ideas than those who didn't. So there's this kind of cross-cultural element. Razan from the halloumi cheese company is a perfect example, where she saw something in the resources in Britain that people in Britain didn't necessarily see. And she had this kind of context of a market, of an industry, of customer preferences in another place that she could bring. And so we obviously see a lot of that with immigrants and refugees bringing kind of new foods, new cultural clothing, new textiles, even new approaches to technology that others didn't see. And so having that advantage of a whole nother set of ideas, like kind of a whole another set of catalysts for ideas that can be created is a big advantage.
It's so interesting because we think of, it's a kind of a form of globalization. We think of globalization as being international, not bringing people to do different kinds of things in new environments. So I found that really fascinating. Yeah. Okay, so that was the second one. Then the third reason that you identify refugees are more likely to become entrepreneurs, I want to ask you about this one, is that they understand customer needs better, or at least have a good understanding of customer needs. Why is that?
This one is sort of a broader point on empathy. When I look at the applications, we do a zero-interest loan program at Mona in partnership with a nonprofit called Kiva. And the applications are striking in that it's often immigrant and refugee entrepreneurs who really, really, really want to contribute to their communities. It's money is a part of it, of course, but there's a real desire to improve their community and satisfy people. And so I think they haven't done any studies on this or anything, but from my experience, there is a lot of a desire to integrate in their communities. And as part of that, it's like, how can I create this as a community-centered venture that can impact people's lives? And so when you come at it from that angle, as opposed to, I want to start a big business and I want to make money or whatever it may be, that is very helpful. And, obviously there's people who come at it from that angle from all walks of life, but I think immigrants and refugees, particularly because they want to create community, they want to find a sense of belonging, they want to help their new community, there's often that. And sometimes it's catered to their own kind of fellow migrant communities, which is why sometimes groups will emerge in one, a lot of Egyptian folks will be in Houston, or a lot of, Syrian folks will be in Cleveland. It's because there's often they'll build it to help their own kind of people who are migrating. And Esma is a good example in the camp because she had a deep empathy for all of these kids, because her own kids were some of them, and she wanted to create an education program that would solve her own problems. And that's the best way if you can start a business that you understand the customer needs that personally. It's quite helpful.
And it's a classic thing where they're not MBA students who are discovering some cool technology or technique and thinking, then how can I sell it? But they're seeing a need and supplying that need. Okay, so that's the third reason. And then the fourth reason that you think refugees are more likely to become entrepreneurs is, again, it's about necessity being the mother of invention, because it's about discrimination, like you mentioned earlier. They're discriminated or excluded from certain forms of traditional employment, right?
Yes, yeah. And so if you're kind of not able, Resign, again, is a good example where she talks about, in a quote to, I believe, a humanitarian group that helped support her, she talks about how it felt like being stabbed in the heart, how many times she was rejected from jobs, because she was eminently qualified, spoke multiple languages, multiple degrees. But the reality is that there, aside from kind of all kinds of other forms of discrimination, like racial discrimination and gender discrimination, there's also this whole set of kind of refugee and asylum seeker questions where, sometimes unconsciously, sometimes purposefully, companies will, either not know how to handle, do you have a work authorization? What is your work authorization? Maybe they're not in a position where they can handle folks who are learning the language during their early stages, or more pernicious or more problematic, where they say, I don't want to deal with folks of this kind of background, or folks who don't understand the culture, whatever it may be. Usually what I've seen, it's more just they aren't proactive. Companies are willing to take the chances and kind of support them, because refugees show that statistics show that they're 2x retention rate. So it's a great ROI to invest in hiring refugees, but often they just don't know kind of how to go about it and don't really build a pipeline. And, there's also a discrimination element. And so it's both not seeking them out, and then when they come through the door, treating them differently. And so that leads to somebody like Razan saying, I have to start something. I don't have any more time.
Okay, so discrimination is the fourth one. And then the last one, you just talk about resilience. And so we've talked a little bit about that, but just tell us why refugee entrepreneurs have more resilience than the average entrepreneur.
Yeah, I think it's just having learned that, when you have your entire world wiped out, sometimes you've lost limbs in your body, or you have big injuries, or from explosions, or you've lost loved ones, or you lost a kid, you've lost a father or mother. At that point, I think the challenges of entrepreneurship and the need to be resilient mentally is a totally, it's not anything compared to what they've had to deal with in terms of fleeing war with nothing really often, going to a camp, relocating multiple times, mental limbo of not knowing where you're going to go, calling on the phone to see how is everything back there. All of that builds a level of resilience at a whole nother category of things, which is life, family, basic needs, basic resources. And so when it comes to the challenges of a business, like I wasn't able to, get legally permitted to do XYZ, or I couldn't find a storefront, or I don't know how to build a website, whatever it is, that's the kind of thing that perhaps if you haven't been hardened by other things, it's hard. But for somebody who's seen all of these things, it's just another obstacle, and a much more minor obstacle to try to overcome. And so,
okay, great. So these are the 5 reasons that you had. A way to survive: you have to innovate. That's number 1. Being exposed to different cultures is 2. Understanding customer needs is 3. Discrimination is 4, and resilience is 5. And I was wondering, Andrew, whether there's a 6th one that I observed in your book, which is this concept you talk about, if I'm saying it correctly, khatwa, slowly, that they're building these companies slowly, and there's no venture investors, demanding business plans and outsized returns and expectations. So perhaps there's less financial pressure, there's less, demand to build up a international franchise or whatever, and that could be a strength.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think, a lot of the community-based or smaller businesses, it's very true. It's the main end result for them is a family business that will be profitable. And so it's not going to be the gain thousands of users and then try to get it acquired or whatever it may be. It's a world of, we need to have, a positive cash flow, and we need to have a business that can, be in the black immediately or pretty soon. And so that's why, they're able to do so much with just a small loan. But, at the same time, a lot of the stories of kind of the biggest companies are immigrants and refugees as well, and so that kind of resourcefulness. I remember hearing the founder of Chobani speak, and Hamdi Ulakaya, and he talked about how the interviewer said, "Oh, why didn't you get VC dollars, for your mission?" He said, he said, "That's not something that I even considered." He immigrated from Turkey. Nobody was knocking down his door on, asking for his PowerPoint deck. He just got kind of a conventional loan and then started it. And, he talked about building his business on Excel and on QuickBooks until it was hundreds of millions in revenue. And so I think there's an element of not being as bloated because you don't have all this investment opportunity. You have to sort of make it somewhat profitable from the beginning. And, just on that note, lots of first-gen folks that we meet, so kids of immigrants like myself, tend to also have a lot of that inherited from their parents. The most famous example being Steve Jobs' dad was a Syrian refugee. I believe Bezos's one of his parents was a Cuban immigrant. So you have people who maybe inherit that kind of scrappiness and that kind of ability to build without a lot of resources.
Sure. Okay, so I want to maybe think about those people who are entrepreneurs but don't have that migrant background, not immediately, perhaps anyway, in their family history. What are the lessons? One obvious lesson I can see is the one about starting with the customer need, not with the cool technology or whatever. But what do you think are the other lessons that come out from your book and your research or your interviewing that would work for all entrepreneurs?
Yeah. I think Esma helped provide some of these when she came to speak to our class on social entrepreneurship. I think one of them, as you said, starting with the customer need and a level of empathy with the customer. Another is kind of what we just talked about a little bit, which is not questioning the need for a lot of capital up front. Like, what is the quickest way you can build an MVP or a prototype that can, test out what's going on? And what's the quickest way and the most scrappy way that you can kind of, rather than rely on a big infusion of money and then hire people quickly, test things out, make sure that there's a product market fit early on, and then grow, through whatever method you have. But I think there tends to be, especially if you're getting access to these opportunities as an MBA student, or there tends to be a feeling of I want to get that article that I raised an XYZ seed around. I think there's a lot of lessons on bootstrapping, on being scrappy, on being profitable early on, and on testing with very little resources that can be learned from. Even Yasmina, probably didn't know early on that will weddings continue? How's this going to go in this new environment? She quickly kind of put that to the test, and before she made her big sale of her jewelry to kind of make that move. So I think that's another one. And then I think there's also an element of just resilience and understanding that if I have all these backup plans and all these options, it's not that much of a risk compared to other people who have done it with so much less. So even just my own experience, again, my dad and my parents aren't refugees, they're immigrants, so they kind of came by choice to the U.S. But just thinking about everything that my dad had to do with little money, not knowing anything about the law in the U.S., having to come up with a medical practice, having to get malpractice insurance, having to legally incorporate, having to lease and then buy offices, that is an amazing thing to be able to do. And so sometimes when I'm paralyzed with, lack of action, I'm like, oh, what's the legal risk of this? Or like, how do I put up a contract for this? And I'm a lawyer, by the way, so it should be easier. And then I think, well, my dad was able to do this and he made it through and he dealt with the problem. So I need to perhaps be a little less thoughtful prospectively and just take action because that's what he did. And partly because he needed to, but I can sort of try to embody that a little more.
Well, Andrew Leon Hanna, it's been so fun to talk to you, and congratulations on your book, which really is a good read, 25 Million Sparks. Thanks for coming on the Chicago Booth Review podcast.
Thanks so much, Hal. Appreciate it.
That's it for this episode of the Chicago Booth Review podcast, part of the University of Chicago Podcast Network. For more research, analysis, and insights, visit our website at chicagobooth.edu/review. When you're there, sign up for our weekly newsletter so you never miss the latest in business-focused academic research. This episode was produced by Josh Stunkel. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe and please do leave us a 5-star review. Until next time, I'm Hal Weitzman. Thanks for listening.